Now that we have the Epic Games Launcher installed and we have a version of Unreal Engine on our system, we're ready to launch Unreal Engine and create a project. Go ahead and click Launch on the version that you're wanting to use, and we'll go ahead and launch the Unreal Engine editor. We're now presented with the Unreal Project browser. Now here is where we can open recent projects or create a new one. So we're going to select Games to create a new project. From here, we're given the option to either choose a blank project or to choose from one of the template projects built in. The template projects have some built-in functionality that you can use to learn from, but since we're going to create our own project from scratch, let's select blank. And we're going to create a C++ project, so choose C++ for the first option. Leave this at maximum quality, ray tracing disabled, and we want this to be a desktop/console app with no starter content. Select a location for the project. And give this project a name. I'm going to call it Shooter, since this is a shooter game. Click Create Project. Now that we have our project created, we're ready to start organizing this into folders. Click on the Content folder and right-click to create a new folder. And we're going to give this folder the name Game, since we're going to keep all of our game content in this folder. But since there will be multiple folders in the Content folder, I'm going to add an underscore at the beginning of this game folder name, and that way it'll always appear at the top as it takes precedence in alphabetical order. Hit enter and right-click on underscore game to create a new folder. I'm going to call this new folder Maps, and this will be where we keep the maps for the game. Go ahead and click on underscore game and select new folder again, and I'm going to call this next folder Character. Click on the game folder, create a new folder, and call this one Game Mode. Now we have these three folders to keep maps, character, and game mode content. Now we have this level here that was created for us by default. It's got a couple things in it already, like a sky and a floor and a player start and some other stuff, but this level isn't really saved. If you go to File and Save Current, we'll be given the option to save this level. And we can go into our Maps folder we just created and save this level. I'm going to call this Default Map and click Save. So we'll be working with this default map for now. In order to make sure that this is the map that loads when we load up our project, let's go to Edit and Project Settings and click Maps and Modes. We can set this as the editor startup map by clicking this drop down and selecting Default Map. We can also set it as the game default map by clicking here and selecting Default Map for the drop down here. Go ahead and close Project Settings. Now you'll notice here in the world settings there's no game mode override set. This means we don't have a game mode set for our project. If you're wondering what the role of a game mode is, click on this drop down next to selected game mode. Everything's grayed out because we don't have a game mode class set, but if we did, we'd have these options that we could set, and these are default classes that are important to the game. For example, the default pawn class determines which type of pawn will get spawned and possessed when you start the game. If there's nothing set here, when you play the game, you get the default pawn, which is a certain type of pawn built into the engine that has the ability to move around in the world using the WASD keys and the mouse, and it's very basic. In fact, it has a mesh. If you hit Shift F1 to gain control of the mouse and click Eject, you can disconnect or unpossess that pawn and move away from it in the world and see that it's got this spherical mesh here. I'm going to go ahead and repossess the pawn, and then I'm going to hit Escape to end the play session. we're going to create our own character and use that as the default pawn. But let's go over to the C++ classes folder, which contains a folder called Shooter. And in this folder, we have a C++ class called Shooter Game Mode Base, and it's a C++ class. Now, as soon as we created this project, Microsoft Visual Studio loaded up, and we can go into Visual Studio, into our project here, and you'll see in the source folder, in the Shooter folder that's in the source folder, we've got some classes here, including shooter.h and shooter.cpp, as well as shooter game mode base.h and shooter game mode base.cpp. Now, if you're not familiar with Unreal Engine's class hierarchy, then you should know that even though it's called shooter game mode base, the class name is called a shooter game mode base, because this game mode inherits ultimately from actor in the inheritance hierarchy. So things like pawns and characters, which also inherit from the actor class, are prefixed with an A in C++ code, even though in the engine you don't see the A at the beginning of the name. So that's something to keep in mind. So we have this shooter game mode base class. And since we have access to it in C++, we can create variables and functions and things here if we want to. In the Unreal Engine editor, we can create a blueprint based on this class, and we're going to stick it in the game mode folder. Let's go ahead and right-click on the class, create a blueprint, and let's rename this to Shooter Game Mode Base BP, and the BP is for blueprint. Click the drop-down in the game folder, and let's select the game mode folder. Click Create Blueprint Class, and now we have a blueprint, and we'll be able to set the default pawn class as soon as we create our character for this game. Now back out here in the world settings for this level, we can set the game mode override to Shooter Game Mode Base BP. In fact, we can set the game mode override for the entire project by going to Edit and Project Settings, Maps and Modes, and right here for the default game mode, we can set this to Shooter Game Mode Base BP. And that will ensure that our Shooter Game Mode Base BP will be used for our entire project. Go ahead and close that out, and let's go ahead and save all and click Save Selected. So we now have our map saved in our Maps folder, and we have our game mode blueprint created, and it's in our game mode folder, and we've set the map that we've created here as the default map for the editor as well as the default map for the game, and we've also set our game mode blueprint as the default game mode for our project, which we can see here in the world settings. Now that our project is set up, in the next video we'll be ready to start creating our character class and continue with the creation of this shooter game.